Hello, this is Chapter 5, How to Amplify What Client Wants using the miracle question. So we are going to talk about the miracle question in this chapter. I know that I have referenced it before, and I promised you that we would get to it in a later chapter, but we have finally arrived at the miracle question. A little bit of insight about the miracle question before we get started with the chapter. I had always, whenever I was in school, and I took this course actually, I loved to hate or hated to love the miracle question, if you will. I know that whenever I first heard about it, I was like, this question is crazy. Like, how am I ever going to use this in practice and be able to work with my clients and ask them this miracle question? Well, there was one day, and I remember it distinctly, that I was doing drug and alcohol outpatient treatment, and I unintentionally found myself asking this question, and I just chuckled to myself, and I thought, wow, here I am thinking I would never use this question, and I find myself using it unintentionally. So just kind of a little funny backstory about my experience with the miracle question and how I actually did use it. And I actually did really great work with that client. I was able to help them figure out, kind of like what it was that they were actually working towards, what their goal was. So you may find yourself using it even if you think it's silly. All right, so let's get started. Let's get serious. So the miracle question. When a client comes into, your setting, they may not always have a clear idea of what they want. We've talked about this in the previous chapter. People don't always have a clear idea of what they want. When they initially come to you, it may be vague. Or we have that random select few that know exactly what they want and they're clear about it and they can tell you about it. But assume that people don't always have a clear idea of what they want. So once they say what they want, help them make it more real and concrete. And again, we've talked about this a few times, develop those well-formed goals with your client. These are goals that are important to the person or client. Remember, they're not important to the practitioner, they are important to the person or client. Something else to think about when you are, working on these well-formed goals and getting started with the miracle question, we perceive ourselves through others' eyes. So help them to develop their well-formed goals by asking relationship questions. We've mentioned several times that relationships to the person are very important to understand and know who they are. So some examples of this might be, if your mother was here and I asked her what would be different when your problem is solved, what would she say? How would your children say that you would be different? And if you have an isolated person who you really just can't find a relationship for them, ask them if your dog could speak. What would they say about you? So kind of a silly one, but I mean, use what you can. Use whatever relationship is important to that person and run with it. All right, so the miracle question, that's where we are at. Something that is interesting that I want to point out is, how did Sue think of this question? Like, where in the world did this miracle question come from? So in your textbook, on the page 91 at the top of it, she talks about this a little bit, and it came from a person's words. She was working with a client, and to her amazement, when she used her words of wanting a miracle, she was able to see a vision for herself and what she wanted. So all she simply did was use some of the skills that we've already talked about and learned using that person's words, and this miracle or well-deformed goal came out of it. So something interesting, and that may or may not be a quiz question. So why do we use the miracle question? It helps people think big, but I use that term lightly because you don't want to think too big that you can't actually work on it. I'm going to stop that there for 1 second, and I'll come back to that. Why else we use it? It helps people focus on future rather than past, and we transition from problem-solving talk to solution-focused talk. And on page 92, there are some guidelines for using the miracle question. So these are important to review and use. When you are using the miracle question, you want to speak slowly, and you want to use a gentle, soft voice when you are talking with them. You want to tell them that you have an unusual or strange question to introduce the solution building process. And you want to use pauses. You want to give it that dramatic effect when you use it. Use future directed words and repeat the phrase, "A miracle happens and the problem that brought you here today is solved." And if they go back to the problem, gently refocus their attention back to like that solution focus or back to the miracle. In your appendix, and I should have mentioned this before in some of your other chapters. I know I may have mentioned it, early on in the introductory videos, but your appendix has a lot of great useful tools. So for example, there is a cheat sheet for goal formation in the back in the appendix on pages 380 to 381. So make sure you reference that too if you want some extra help with that, or just, have that cheat sheet handy. So this will help you to kind of look and think in this way. So keep in mind that people don't seek help as their first option, and it tends to be their last resort. They don't always just run to the first therapist that they can to kind of get the help that they need. It might be a last resort for them. So what if they describe what they do not want? So for example, I want him to stop whatever it is. Acknowledge how worried, upset they are, and that they have a good reason to be upset or worried, given what they have told you so far. Then immediately add, so when things are getting better, what will that person be doing instead? So that's a way to kind of challenge or tackle that. When asking the person what will be different, what if the person starts telling you that their wife or kids will do better and ignores their own part? So again, that not taking their role or responsibility in it. Go with it. Ask what their wife or kids will be doing differently than now. Then when they tell you, ask them what their wife or kids would see you or the person doing differently. Shift the focus back without opposing the person. We want to reduce resistance when you're working with them. Why do goals have to be described in concrete behavioral measurable terms? Well, you want to know whether they are doing something or not, and you and they can tell if they are making progress towards their solution. So what if the goal doesn't seem realistic to you? I mentioned this before. I said you want to help them think big, but you don't want them to think so big that it's unrealistic. So if it doesn't seem realistic, you do have to kind of work on that with the person. I know I've kind of emphasized this many, many times that it's not about the practitioner, it's about the client, but you also don't want to set them up for failure when you're working with them as well. So for example, my kids will get along all the time. Well, we know that that's not realistic because unfortunately, kids are going to have bad days, or kids are going to have moments where they're not getting along with their siblings or maybe with other kids. So you can ask them if that is something they can do if it is realistic. So again, putting it on them to make them understand, is this really a realistic goal or not? If they insist that it is, you could ask how they know it's possible, or you can make a statement, that normalizing, well, they are still kids. How do people usually feel about seeking help? We said that seeking help is not always a first resort, it's typically a last resort. So they may feel ashamed or guilty or disappointed, and that they might feel responsible for their problems, unlike physical health problems. So why do we tell the person that their problems will take hard work to resolve? Well, because we're not going to do it for them. You want to tell the person that they were right in taking that drastic step of seeking help. If the person makes little or no progress, they won't feel like such a failure if the problem does require hard work. So, you can't just tell them that snap your fingers and magically make all their problems go away. Unfortunately, we're not miracle workers, we're change workers. If they progress quickly, they may feel good about themselves. You're putting responsibility on the person for change. It's not your responsibility to change them. You can't take personal account for that. And my addition is you're setting a tone for the interaction. We are working together on this. And you're not chatting or being friends with the person. You're establishing that professional relationship with them. And it especially might be necessary if you're working with kids or adolescents whose work is play, and they may want to stay kind of at that play level. So some food for thought with that. In your textbook, there's the transcript with Ayan, the 30-year-old Asian American woman, and we reference Ayan several times throughout this, and she's with her 2 young children. This is pages 92 to 95. There was, she's talking a little bit about anxiety, and her miracle is that she would be more of herself. She'd be calm, smiling, doing more around the house, stuff like that. Peter explores with Ayan what specific family members would notice about her miracle, and then what part would be the easiest to do. And she would maybe talk to her husband more. There's another transcript in this chapter with the Williams family. And although it is a family case, we can learn some things about working with individuals from it. So make sure you read that one too. There was, in the Williams family transcript, the reality check for Gladys is, my children will listen to me, and then Sue checks to see if she expects them to listen all the time. So that realistic goal thing we were talking about. It differentiates wish, for them. Sometimes you think they would from reality, not always. And both were statements from Gladys. Something else that I want to put on the table for you guys too is, depending on who you're working with, how this miracle question will work. The word miracle may be too abstract for young children, particularly ones without, instruction. So you can use maybe like magic wand, gold dust magic, something like that. They may not be able to fully understand what a miracle is. So be mindful of that. You can still use the miracle question with kids, but you just may have to change up the wording a little bit, but the guidelines will still apply. And you can see from this transcript with Gladys, the professional helps the person to identify goals for herself, and the kids identify strengths. And in the process, we learned the root of Gladys's parenting difficulties. She said, didn't nobody care about me when I was little? And, determination that if I had kids, I wouldn't want to treat my kids like that because the things that they did to me wasn't right. So it is normal to feel awkward when you are using the miracle question or thinking about using the miracle question. It is very normal. I told you a little bit about my experience with the miracle question back when I was in school and how I applied it. It is very normal to feel awkward. It is normal to not feel capable of sustaining a conversation about well-formed goals. It's something, you have to practice and you have to keep working at it for it to kind of seem a little bit more normal for you or less awkward. Types of questions that were asked by Sue in order in this session were, what would have to happen for the persons to think this was worth their time? What would be different when the problem was solved? What do you suppose has to happen? And then the miracle question, and then relationship questions. So that was kind of that rundown with that. When you're using the miracle question, you should not expect to achieve closure with the person. When amplifying the miracle picture, you're amplifying what that miracle would be like. Persons should be free to explore various possibilities. So don't move at the first one. Definitely something to kind of keep in mind with that. And if the miracle seems impossible or distant, ask them to think about a more realistic one for them. So some things to kind of keep in mind with this. So I also wanted to kind of give you an example of how you might use the miracle question, or kind of give you an example of how you use that miracle question. So with the miracle question, if you have somebody in your office and you're working with them, you want to ask them, okay, so we know what brought them in and we know kind of an idea of what they want to work on. So you would ask the person, okay, so suppose that when you go to sleep tonight, that I forgot, I already messed it up already. I'm sorry. Okay, so first, when you sit the person down and you talk to them, you want to kind of let them know, okay, this is a little bit of a weird question that I'm going to ask you, but we're going to kind of work with it and see where we go. So suppose when you go home tonight and you go to sleep, a miracle happens, and it's happening while you're sleeping, so you don't know that the miracle has happened. But when you wake up in the morning, what would you think would be the first thing you would notice that something is different? And going back, the miracle is going to be what you want to happen. It's what you want your life to be like. So what would be the first thing that you would notice? Some other questions you want to ask that person would be the relationship questions. What would your significant other notice? What would your dog notice? What would your brother or sister notice? Or the kids or your coworkers? What would those people notice? You would explore that. Another thing that you would, kind of keep rolling with this miracle question is, what would you notice about yourself? What would you notice would be different? the next step would be is, okay, so now that we've defined what this miracle would be like and we know, what others would notice about this miracle, think back now into your life and think about, is there any times now where a little bit of this miracle has already happened? You want to explore that with the person. Kind of see, when we get that answer to the question, we can kind of move into that question before, is what have you tried that has worked, or what have you tried that hasn't worked? So that's kind of where those questions will come into. And then you want to explore with a person, what could you do that would make your life a little bit more like this miracle would have happened or will happen? So there's definitely a lot of different questions that kind of can stem from this that you can kind of bounce off of. But I wanted to give you a very generic idea of how the miracle question would be. Obviously, it would be very different if I was demonstrating with you, actually interviewing somebody with it. But those are some ideas that you want to kind of keep in mind. And the miracle question will be very useful for you to help that person develop their goals, as well as help them develop on parts that they can work on now. Small steps towards working towards that goal. All right. Thank you very much for watching this video.